My name is Laura Chen. I'm 32 years old, and I want to tell you about the morning my dog saved my mother's life and about the 8 years before that morning during which my family told me, consistently and with complete confidence, that he was a waste of money. His name is Biscuit. He is a 7-year-old golden retriever mix with ears that are slightly too large for his head and a personality that has, in the years since I brought him home, converted approximately 40% of my family's skeptics into people who send him birthday cards. He is not a trained detection dog. He has no formal scent work certification. He is a dog I adopted from a shelter at age 8 weeks because he was the one who came to the front of his kennel when I walked in, and the one who fell asleep in my arms on the drive home, and the one who has been my most consistent companion through 2 job changes and 1 significant relationship and 1 global pandemic and the ordinary accumulation of a life. He is also the reason my mother is alive. But I need to start where the story actually. I brought Biscuit home when I was 24. I was living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Raleigh, North Carolina, working my first real job out of college as a data analyst for a logistics company, earning a salary that was adequate but not comfortable, and spending approximately 40% of it on an apartment I liked and the rest on the ordinary costs of an adult life. My family's response to the dog was delivered characteristically in layers. My father said. My mother said, "You can't afford a dog on that salary." My older sister Ellen said, "Laura, do you know how much vet bills cost?" My Aunt Diane, who had a particular talent for the specific comment that landed hardest, said, "You're going to spend your 20s cleaning up after an animal instead of building your future." These were not cruel comments. They were practical comments, delivered by people who had evaluated my financial situation and my living situation and had arrived at the conclusion that adding a dog to both was a poor decision. They were not entirely wrong about the practical calculus. Dogs do cost money. Apartments do have limitations. Vet bills are real. They were wrong about everything that mattered. I kept Biscuit. I want to walk through the 8 years that followed because the 8 years are the content. Biscuit was from the beginning a specific kind of dog, not trained in any formal sense, not working toward any certification, not the product of careful breeding for a particular trait. He was a shelter dog who had grown up in a family that loved him and treated him as the full participant in household life that he clearly believed himself to be. He had, in the way of golden retrievers generally and in the way of Biscuit specifically, an extraordinarily scent. This was not remarkable. Golden retrievers are among the breeds most commonly used in scent detection work precisely because their olfactory capability is exceptional. Biscuit had the genetic inheritance of a dog built to smell things. Living in my apartment, then in a house when I moved to a better job, he exercised this capability constantly, tracking the specific scent histories of everything in the environment, alerting me to the presence of a neighbor's cat in the hallway before I had opened the door, finding the precise location of a lost set of keys under a couch cushion by the specific warm smell of my hand on the key ring. He was not trained to find gas leaks. He was trained to sit, stay, come, and not pull on the leash. He found the gas leak because he was a golden retriever with an exceptional nose, and because whatever a gas leak smells like to a dog with that nose, it was apparently significant enough to be worth communicating about. But I am getting ahead of the story. The family's comments about Biscuit did not stop in year 1. In year 2, when Biscuit developed a stomach issue that required a veterinary visit and some diagnostic work, my mother said, "See, this is what I was talking about. The bills. The bills were $400. I paid them from my savings without particular difficulty." Biscuit recovered. I did not mention to my mother that the $400 had not inconvenienced me in any significant way, because mentioning it would have produced a conversation I did not want to have. In year 3, when I moved from Raleigh to Charlotte for a better job and brought Biscuit with me, Ellen said, "Are you sure it's practical to be moving a dog across the state for a job?" I said, "Yes." She said, "It complicates things." I said, "A lot of things complicate things." "Biscuit comes with me." She said, "Laura, you're going to limit yourself professionally because of a dog." I said, "I've taken a better job in a larger city. My career is going well. Biscuit is with me," she said. I said, "Yes, for now and for the foreseeable future." She said it as though the dog were a choice I was making against my own interests, when in fact the dog was not a choice in competition with my interests but a companion alongside them. The framework through which my family evaluated Biscuit was the framework of cost-benefit analysis applied to a relationship, and relationships do not respond well to cost-benefit analysis. My Aunt Diane, visiting for a holiday in year 4, sat on my couch while Biscuit occupied the other half of it and said, "Laura, do you ever think about what you could do with the money you spend on this dog?" I said, "Not really." She said, "The food alone, the vet visits, the grooming." I said, "I also spend money on groceries and medical care and haircuts. It's the cost of having a living member of the household." She said, "He's a dog." I said, "Yes, he's a dog. She said, "You're too attached." I said, "I don't think there's a correct amount of attachment to something you love." She said, "When you have a family." I said, "I have a family. You're in it." She said, "A husband, children." I said, "Those are possible future things." Biscuit is a current thing. She said, "He's going to be a problem when you meet someone." I said, "The someone I meet will have to be compatible with Biscuit. That's a feature, not a bug." She said, "Laura." I said, "Aunt Diane." She said, "You're 28 years old and your priorities are backwards." I said, "I respectfully disagree." She said nothing more on the subject, but she had said enough. My mother was more restrained than Diane in her comments but consistent in her position. The position was, the dog was a choice I could afford in a narrow financial sense, but that was not the best use of my resources and that I would eventually understand this. Year 5, Year 6. The comments became less frequent as it became clear that the dog was a permanent feature of my life and that the permanent feature was not, in fact, causing the problems they had predicted. My career had continued to develop. I had bought a house. I was by any visible measure doing fine. The comments did not stop, they modulated. In Year 7, my mother said, "I will admit that dog is very well behaved." I said, "Thank you." She said, "I still think you spin." I said, "I know you do." She said, "But he is very well behaved." I said, "He is." This was as close to an acknowledgement as 8 years of the dog had produced, and then came the morning. My mother had moved to Charlotte 2 years earlier after my father retired, and they decided to downsize from the house I had grown up in to something more manageable. They had a townhouse in a development about 20 minutes from my house. My father traveled frequently in retirement. He had taken up a consulting arrangement that brought him to clients in other cities for days at a time, and my mother was often alone. I visited once a week, usually on Sundays. I brought Biscuit because my mother had reached, over the previous year, a state of grudging tolerance for him that occasionally manifested as allowing him on the couch when she thought I wasn't watching. On a Thursday in November, I received a call from my mother that was unusual. She called in the morning, which she did not typically do, and her voice had a quality that I had not heard before, not distressed exactly, but slightly off, the specific quality of someone who is not at their normal baseline in a way they might not be aware of. She said, "Laura, I'm feeling a little strange." I said, "What kind of strange?" She said, "A little dizzy. I have a headache." I thought it might be the weather, but it's been a few hours. I said, "Have you eaten this morning?" She said, "Yes, I'm fine. I just thought I'd mention it." I said, "Do you want me to come over?" She said, No, I'm fine. I don't know. I wanted to hear your voice." Calling to hear my voice was not something my mother did. I said, "I'm coming over." She said, "Laura, you're working." I said, "I'm working from home today. I can work from your house. I'll be there in 20 minutes. She said, "You don't need to bring the dog." I said, "Biscuit goes where I go, Mom." She said, "Laura." I said, "I'm coming." I put Biscuit in the car and drove to my mother's townhouse. I want to describe what happened when I got there because the sequence matters. I used my key to let us in. My mother had given me a key when they moved in, a practical arrangement for the times when she and my father both needed to be away. I came in through the front door with Biscuit on the leash. Not the stopping of a dog who has seen something he wants to investigate. A different kind of stopping, an abrupt, full-body halt, the specific stillness of an animal who has encountered something in the environment that has captured his entire attention. He was at the front door. He had not moved past the threshold. He looked up at me, then he did something I had not seen him do before. He turned to face the hallway that led toward the kitchen and the utility room, and he sat down, and he made the specific sound that was somewhere between a whine and a bark that he produced when he was trying to communicate something he considered important. He did this twice. I have thought about that moment many times since. Why I listened. Why instead of saying "Come on, Biscuit," and walking past him into the kitchen, I stopped and paid attention to what he was doing. I think the answer is that I had lived with Biscuit for 7 years, and I knew what his ordinary behavior looked like, and this was not his ordinary behavior. The stillness, the direction he was facing, the sound, none of it was the ordinary language of a dog entering a familiar house. It was something else. And I had learned through 7 years of living with a dog with an exceptional nose to pay attention when he was communicating about something I couldn't perceive. I smelled it a second after I started paying attention. Not strongly, not the overwhelming, obvious smell that people describe when there's a major gas leak. A faint smell, the kind that is easy to dismiss as a nearby neighbor's cooking or a passing odor from outside, but it was there. I picked up Biscuit and walked back out the front door. I called my mother from the front step. She answered. She sounded slightly more muddled than she had on the phone earlier. I said, "Mom, come outside right now. Use the front door. Don't turn anything on or off on the way." She said, "What, Laura? I'm fine." I said, "Mom, come outside now. I'm at the front door. Just walk to the front door and come outside." She said, "You're here?" I said, "Yes, come outside." She came outside. She was moving slightly slowly, the specific quality of someone who is not entirely well and does not fully know it. She had been inside the house for several hours. The headache and dizziness she had described on the phone were symptoms I recognized immediately, in retrospect, as consistent with low-level carbon monoxide exposure from a gas leak. The gradual accumulation of symptoms that people often do not connect to their environment because they come on slowly, and because people who are experiencing early-stage poisoning often do not have the clarity to recognize that something external is causing them to feel wrong. I had her. I called 911. I called the gas company. I kept her outside. The gas company arrived in 17 minutes. The technician confirmed a leak in the line feeding the furnace in the utility room, a connection that had been compromised, possibly over time, possibly accelerated by the cold weather expanding and contracting the metal. The leak was significant enough that the technician reviewing the level in the house said that another hour or two and we would have been dealing with something considerably more serious. He said, "Did you smell it from outside?" I said, "My dog did." He looked at Biscuit, who was sitting next to my mother with his head in her lap in the specific way he had when someone needed settling. The technician said, "Good dog." My mother looked at Biscuit. Biscuit looked at my mother. She put her hand on his head. She did not say anything. The paramedics who arrived as a precaution assessed my mother and found her oxygen levels slightly depressed but not at a dangerous level. They recommended fresh air and monitoring. She was fine within an hour of being outside. The furnace line was repaired that afternoon. The technician confirmed the house was safe before she was allowed back in. I stayed with her until my father arrived that evening. He had driven back from his consulting engagement when I called him. 4 hours on the highway, arriving at dinner time with the specific tight quality of someone who has been managing fear in a car for 4 hours, and is only now allowing it to resolve. He walked in and looked at his wife, sitting at the kitchen table with Biscuit at her feet, and he sat down across from her and took her hands and did not say anything. Then he said, "How are you?" She said, "I'm fine." Laura got here in time. He looked at me. I said, "Biscuit got here in time." He looked at the dog. Biscuit wagged his tail, which was the appropriate response. My father said, "The dog?" I said, "Yes." He said, "The dog found the leak." I said, "He stopped at the front door and wouldn't come in. He sat and made the sound he makes when he's trying to tell me something. I smelled it about 30 seconds after I started paying it." My father looked at Biscuit for a long moment. He said, "I told you that dog was an unnecessary expense." I said, "Yes, you did." He said, "Once." I think I said it once. I said, "Once." Mom said it more. He looked at my mother. She was looking at the dog. She said, "Biscuit." The dog looked up at her. She said, "I told your mother you were a waste of money." Biscuit wagged his tail again. She said, "I was wrong about that." She said it to the dog, which was both the most unexpected and the most perfect delivery of an admission I had ever witnessed. I want to describe the conversation that happened later that evening, after my father had eaten and my mother had rested and the crisis had fully resolved into something that could be discussed rather than survived. My father said, "I want to understand something." I said, "Yes." He said, "The dog knew." I said, "I can't say he knew in the way we know things. But he detected something significant in the environment and he communicated about it." My father said, "He stopped at the door." I said, "Yes." He said, "And did the thing." I said, "The sound he makes when he's trying to tell me something." My father said, "And you listened?" I said, "Yes." He said, "How did you know to listen?" I said, "I've been living with him for 7 years. I know what his ordinary behavior looks like." "That wasn't his ordinary behavior." He said, "That's what happens when you live with an animal attentively." He said, "Attentively?" I said, "Yes." He said, "And if you hadn't been paying attention?" I said, "I don't know. I might have walked past him. I might have assumed he was being weird and ignored it." He said, "But you didn't." I said, "No." He said, "Because you know him." I said, "Yes." He said, "Because you've spent 7 years knowing him." I said, "Yes." He said, "Diana?" I said, "Laura." He said, "Laura, I apologize. Your mother and I both told you the dog was a mistake." I said, "Yes." He said, "We told you that you were spending money irresponsibly." I said, "Yes." He said, "And that you were too attached." I said, "Yes." He said, "And we were wrong." I said, "Yes." He said, "About which part?" I said, "About the attachment specifically. The attachment is why I could read him. If I had kept him at arm's length, if I hadn't been paying attention to him for 7 years, I would have walked past what he would." He said the attachment was the thing that saved her. I said, "The attachment and his nose." "Yes." He said, "His exceptional nose." I said, "Golden retrievers are built for scent work. I didn't train him for this. He smelled it and he told me and I listened because I knew him well enough to understand what he was saying." He said, "You speak dog." I said, "A specific dog." "Yes." He said, "Laura?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I'd like to meet this dog properly." I looked at Biscuit, who was still stationed near my mother's feet. I said, "Biscuit, come here." Biscuit came to my father. My father put his hand out. Biscuit sniffed it with the thoroughness of someone who is being professional about the introduction. Then he wagged his tail. My father put his hand on the dog's head. He said, "Hello, Biscuit." Biscuit wagged his tail again. My father said, "I'm sorry I called you an unnecessary expense." Biscuit accepted this apology by sitting on my father's foot, which was very Biscuit. My father laughed. My mother from across the table said, "He's sitting on your foot." My father said, "Yes." My mother said, "He does that when he likes you." My father said, "Does he?" My mother said, "He does it to me sometimes when I visit Laura." I said, "I didn't know you'd noticed that." My mother said, "I notice things." She said, "I just don't always say I notice them." I said, "Yes, I said, "Yes." She said, "I noticed the dog was a good dog a long time ago. I just kept saying it was a waste of money because I had said it was a waste of money and I didn't want to revise." I said, "Yes." She said, "That's stubborn." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm stubborn." I said, "Yes." She said, "It runs in the family." I said, "Yes." She said, "You're stubborn too." I said, "I kept the dog." She said, "Yes, you did." She said, "I'm glad you kept the dog." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm glad you kept the dog and I'm sorry I told you he was a waste of money." I said, "I know, Mom." She said, "Is that enough?" I said, "It's what we have, and it's enough." She said, "He's a good dog." I said, "He's the best dog." She said, "Don't tell him that. He'll get a big head." Biscuit had moved from my father's foot back to my mother's side and was looking up at her with the expression he used when he was waiting to see what happened next. She looked at him. She said, "You're a good boy." He wagged his tail. She put her hand on his head again. She said, "A very good boy." He wagged his tail harder. My father watched this and said nothing, but his expression had the quality of someone who has revised something significant and is sitting in the revision without needing to narrate it. I stayed until 9. When I left, my mother walked me to the door. Biscuit was leashed and ready. She crouched down, which at 66 required some effort, and she held his face in her hands the way people hold dogs' faces when they are saying something to them that they mean completely. She said, "Thank you." He licked her nose. She laughed. She stood up and looked at me. She said, "He licked my nose." I said, "He does that. It means he likes you." She said, "He's like me this whole time." I said, "Yes, you've been coming to my house for 7 years." he's liked you the whole. She said, and I kept telling you he was a waste of money. I said yes. She said, well, he liked me. I said yes. She said, dogs are better than people. I said, some dogs. She said, this one. I said yes, this one. She kissed me on the cheek. She said, drive safe. I drove home. What happened in the weeks after the morning is the part of this story that I find most interesting to describe because it was the most unexpected. My mother started asking about Biscuit in our. Not casually, specifically. How was he? What had he done this week? Was he eating well? Did he have any vet appointments coming up? She had never asked about him specifically before. He had been present. He had been tolerated. He had been the subject of commentary about my choices. He had not been someone she inquired after. She inquired after him now. In December, she asked if she could come on one of our walks. I said, Biscuit and I walk in the park on Saturday. You're welcome to join us. She said, what time? I said 8. She said, I'll be there. She was there. We walked for an hour. She held the leash for part of it at her request, and Biscuit, who calibrated his pace beautifully to the person at the other end of the leash, walked at a pace that suited her without being told to. She said, he's very gentle. I said yes. She said, he knew to slow down for me. I said, he reads people well. She said, he read the gas leak. I said yes. She said, I was the one who didn't read him. I said, you read him now. She said, I'm learning. She came on 3 more walks before the end of the year. My Aunt Diane, hearing about this from my mother, called me and said, your mother is walking the dog with you. I said yes. She said, the dog, she said, was a waste of money. I said yes. She said, every Saturday. I said, most Saturdays now. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. She said, Laura. I said yes. She said, I said some things about that dog. I said yes, you did. She said, I said you were too attached, that you were wasting money, that the dog would limit your professional life. I said yes. She said, did any of that happen? I said no. She said, you bought a house. I said yes. She said, you have a career that's going well. I said yes. She said, and the dog found a gas leak. I said yes. She said, and now your mother is walking him on Saturday mornings. I said yes. I said yes. She said, I was wrong about the dog, about what you could afford, about the attachment, all of it. I said, I know. She said, I'm going to come on a walk too if that's allowed. I said, it's a public park, Diane, anyone can walk there. She said, I mean with you and your mother and the dog. I said, yes, that's allowed. She came in January. She and my mother walked on either side of me, and Biscuit walked ahead on his leash with the specific purposeful quality of a dog who has a job to do, and the job is walking. My aunt said, he walks well. I said, he's had 7 years of practice. She said, with you? I said yes. She said, you've been walking this dog for 7 years. I said yes. She said, rain and cold and everything. I said yes. She said, and we told you it was a waste of money. I said yes. I said yes. She said, in your mother's house. I said yes. She said, Laura. I said yes. She said, I want to apologize for the years of commentary. I said, I appreciate that. She said, it wasn't my place. I said, no, it wasn't. She said, he's a good dog. I said yes. She said, a very good dog. I said yes. Biscuit looked back at us from the end of the leash as if he had heard this assessment and found it accurate. My aunt laughed. My mother laughed. I am 32 years old. I have a 7-year-old golden retriever mix named Biscuit who found a gas leak in my mother's house on a Thursday in November and communicated about it to the person he trusted most, and who is now walked on Saturday mornings by a 66-year-old woman who spent 8 years telling her daughter he was a waste of money. She holds the leash now. She asks about his vet appointments. She says good boy with the specific sincerity of someone who has completely revised a position and is comfortable with the revision. My father met him properly on the night of the gas leak and said, I apologize for calling you an unnecessary expense. Biscuit accepted this apology by sitting on his foot. My Aunt Diane walked with us in January and said, I want to apologize for the years of commentary. Biscuit accepted this apology by being an excellent dog for the entire walk. None of them had to revise anything publicly. None of them had to announce they were wrong to a room full of people. The revision happened in a kitchen, a front door in a park, over walks and phone calls, and a hand on a dog's head. That is how these things happen, not dramatically, not all at once, but completely in the end. I am 32 years old. Biscuit is 7. He is not a waste of money. He is not a limit on my professional life. He is not a problem. He is the member of this household who found the thing no one else could smell and communicated about it to the one person he trusted to listen. And I listened because I had spent 7 years learning his language. That is the whole of the story. That is enough. That has always been enough. Some dogs find gas leaks. Some daughters keep the dog anyway. And some Saturday mornings in a public park become the place where 8 years of waste of money finally resolves into something that walks well on a leash and accepts apologies by sitting on your foot. That is everything. That is enough. That is Biscuit. There is something I want to add that happened 4 months after the morning because it is the most unexpected part of the story and the part that tells me that revision, when it comes, can go further than you think. My mother called me in March. She said, Laura, I've been doing research. I said, on what? She said, on golden retrievers, on their olfactory capability, on scent detection. I said, okay. She said, did you know that golden retrievers have approximately 300 million olfactory receptors? I said, I knew it was a very high number. I didn't know the specific number. She said, humans have about 6 million. I said, yes. She said, so Biscuit can smell 50 times. I said, approximately. The mechanism is also different, not just the quantity. She said, I read about that too, the Jacobson's organ. I said, the vomeronasal organ. Yes. She said, they have a second smell system. I said, yes. She said, that processes chemical information separately from the main olfactory system. I said, yes. She said, so when he stopped at the door, I said he was processing something through both systems simultaneously. The main olfactory detection and the chemical communication channel. She said he knew something was wrong. I said he detected something significant. Whether he understood it as wrong in the way we understand wrong, I can't say, but he detected it as significant and he communicated about it. She said, to you? I said yes. She said, because he trusted you? I said yes. She said, because you had spent 7 years building that trust? I said yes. She said, Laura? I said yes. She said, I've been thinking about something you said the night of the gas leak. I said, what did I say? She said, you said the attachment was the thing that saved me, that if you had kept him at arm's length, if you hadn't been paying attention to him for 7 years, you would have walked past what he was trying to tell you. I said yes. She said, I've been thinking about that. I said, what have you been thinking? She said, that I told you the attachment was a problem. That I said you were too attached. I said yes. She said, and the attachment was the thing. I said yes. She said, I told you to be less attached to the thing that saved my life. I said, you didn't know it was going to save your life. None of us did. She said, no, but I was telling you how to relate to your dog, and I was wrong. I said yes. She said, not just factually wrong, wrong in a way that if you had listened to me, if you had kept him at arm's length the way I said yes. She said, I would have been in that house for another hour or two. I said yes. She said, Laura? I said yes. She said, I need to say something and I need you to let me say it completely before you respond. I said, okay. She said, I spent 8 years telling you that your relationship with your dog was too much, too attached, too expensive, too present. I said it with confidence, the way I say things I consider settled. And what I was actually doing was telling you to be less of who you are. She said, you're a person who pays attention, who builds real relationships with the things you love, who listens when those things are trying to communicate something, and I kept telling you that those qualities applied to a dog were a problem. She said, they're not a problem, they're why I'm talking to you right now. She said, not just the dog's nose, your attention, your 7 years of learning him. Your willingness to listen when he stopped at the door instead of walking past. She said, I told you to be less attentive, and your attentiveness saved my life. She said, I'm sorry for 8 years of it, all of it. I said nothing for a moment. She said, you can respond now. I said, Mom. She said, yes. I said, thank you. She said, that's all. I said, that's everything. She said, it doesn't seem like enough. I said, it's what I needed. It's enough. She said, Laura, I've been walking with Biscuit every Saturday for 4 months. I said, I know. She said, I look forward to it. I said, I know. She said, I look forward to it more than most things I do in a week. I said, I know. She said, he doesn't judge me for what I said for 8 years. I said, no, he doesn't. She said, dogs don't hold grudges. I said, no. She said, people should be more like that. I said, sometimes. She said, I'm going to try. She said, less holding on to positions I've already stated. More listening when something is trying to tell me something. I said, that sounds good. She said, like Biscuit. I said, yes, like Biscuit. She said, he set a good example. I said, he's an excellent example in many ways. She said, 50 times better than us at smelling things. I said, approximately. She said, and better at not holding grudges. I said, significantly. She laughed. I laughed. She said, Saturday. I said, 8 o'clock. She said, I'll be there. She was there. She's always there. Every Saturday at 8 in the park 20 minutes from my house, my mother holds Biscuit's leash and walks beside me and does not say anything about waste of money or too attached or it's a mistake. She asks how he is. She tells him he's a good boy. He walks at her pace without being told. He sits on her foot sometimes. She lets him. I am 32 years old. Biscuit is 7. My mother is 66 and walks with us every Saturday and has read about golden retriever olfactory receptors and the vomeronasal organ and knows that her dog, she calls him her dog now in a way that I have not corrected, can smell 50 times better than she can. She knows this because she did the research. After he saved her life, after she spent 8 years telling me he was a waste of money, the revision was complete, slower than the gas leak. More thorough than the apology at the kitchen table. Complete, that is enough, that is everything. Some dogs find gas leaks. Some daughters keep the dog, some mothers do the research. And some Saturday mornings in March, a 66-year-old woman holds a golden retriever's leash in a public park and says, he can smell 50 times better than us. And the daughter says, approximately. And the dog walks ahead with the specific purposeful quality of an animal who has a job to do. He is very good at it. He has always been very good at it. That is the whole of it. That is everything. That is Biscuit. One more thing. My father, who made the one comment about unnecessary expense and has spent 8 years being less vocal than my mother and aunt about Biscuit, called me in April. He said, Laura, I want to tell you something. I said, yes. He said, I've been thinking about the night of the gas leak. I said, yes. He said, I drove 4 hours to get home. 4 hours in a car thinking about what I would find when I got there. I said, yes. He said, and what I found was my wife at the kitchen table with your dog at her feet. I said, yes. He said, and she was fine because you came when she called, and you listened to the dog, and you got her outside. I said, yes. He said, Laura, I want to say something that I should have said 8 years ago when you brought that dog home. I said, okay. He said, I should have said, Laura, you've made a choice that makes sense for you and I trust your judgment. Instead, I said, a dog in an apartment. I said, yes. He said, I framed it as a practical objection. But the real thing was that I didn't think a dog was serious enough for the life I imagined you building. I said, yes. He said, and it turns out that the dog was the most serious decision you made in your 20s. I said, Dad. He said, I mean it. The most consequential. One that mattered most. I said, he matters to me. He always has. He said, I know that now. He said, I should have known it earlier. He said, Laura. I said, yes. He said, you were right and I was wrong and I'm glad you didn't listen to me. I said, I knew you'd come around eventually. He said, it only took a gas leak. I said, to be fair, it took 8 years and a gas leak. He said, yes, that's more honest. He said, I'm going to come on the Saturday walk sometime. He said, I want to properly thank the dog. I said, he'll accept the thanks. He's very gracious about it. He said, I imagine he is. He said, Laura. I said, yes. He said, I love you. I said, I love you too, Dad. He said, and tell Biscuit. I said, I'll tell him. I told Biscuit. He wagged his tail. That was enough. That has always been enough. That is everything.